The first spotter disappeared at dawn. No gunshot, no scream, just silence where there had been movement 30 seconds before. Sergeant David Harker froze in the treeline, listening. The German observation post was still there, a concrete bunker on the hilltop 200 meters away. But the man who had been standing outside, smoking a cigarette, was gone. Harker scanned the area through binoculars, searching for any sign of what had happened. Nothing. The cigarette still smoldered on the ground. The rifle leaned against the bunker wall, but the man had vanished. Harker's hands tightened on the binoculars. Something was wrong. Something was moving out there that he couldn't see. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. It was March 1945, and the war in Europe was grinding toward its end. The Allies had crossed the Rhine and were pushing deep into Germany, but the fighting remained brutal. Every town, every hill, every bridge was contested. The Germans, desperate and cornered, fought with the ferocity of men who had nothing left to lose. They had retreated into defensive positions, fortified villages and observation posts scattered across the landscape, each one a nest of machine guns, snipers, and mortars. Taking these positions meant climbing exposed slopes, crossing open fields, moving through kill zones where German spotters could see everything and call down artillery on any target that appeared. Harker's unit, Baker Company of the 30th Infantry Division, had been tasked with clearing a sector near the town of Hemer in North Rhine-Westphalia. The terrain was hilly, covered with patches of forest and open farmland. The Germans held the high ground, a series of ridges and hilltops that gave them perfect visibility over the surrounding area. Every time Baker Company tried to advance, German spotters would see them, radio their position, and artillery would rain down minutes later. The company had lost 11 men in 2 days without gaining a single yard ground. The officers held meeting after meeting, trying to figure out how to break the stalemate. The answer kept coming back to the same problem. The spotters, as long as the Germans could see them coming, they couldn't advance. Harker was 26 years old, a veteran of Normandy, the Bulge, and a dozen other battles. He had joined the Army in 1942, a year after Pearl Harbor, and had spent 3 years learning how to survive in combat. He wasn't a natural soldier. Before the war, he had been a surveyor in Oregon, spending his days mapping forests and plotting roads. He liked solitude, precision, and patience. The Army had recognized something in him, though. He moved quietly. He observed carefully. He thought in terms of terrain and angles and sight lines. They made him a scout, then a squad leader, then a sergeant. He was good at it, not because he was brave or aggressive, but because he understood how to read the land, how to see what others missed. And what Harker had seen in this sector was something unusual. The Germans weren't just using standard observation techniques. They had positioned their spotters in a network, overlapping fields of view, covering every approach route. But the network had a weakness. The spotters relied on visual contact to coordinate. They used hand signals, mirrors, and line-of-sight communication because radio traffic could be intercepted. That meant they had to see each other. And if they had to see each other, there were blind spots in the network. Narrow corridors where movement might go undetected if someone moved in exactly the right way. Harker had developed a technique he called the shadow link. It was based on an idea he had learned as a surveyor. Objects in shadow are harder to see not just because they're dark, but because the human eye struggles to focus on them when transitioning from bright to dark areas. In the field, that meant if you move along the edge of shadows, staying just inside the dark boundary, you became difficult for observers to track. But Harker took it further. He realized that if you synchronize your movement with natural motion in the environment, like wind moving through trees or clouds passing overhead, you could blend your silhouette into the shifting patterns of light and shadow. It wasn't invisibility. It was visual confusion. The spotter's brain would register movement, but it wouldn't register it as a threat because it matched the background noise of the environment. Harker had used the technique successfully on several occasions during scouting missions. He had moved through enemy territory undetected, gathered intelligence, and returned without being spotted. But when he tried to teach the method to his squad, they struggled. It required intense focus, an intuitive sense of timing, and the ability to move in ways that felt unnatural. Most soldiers were trained to move quickly, aggressively, decisively. The shadow link demanded the opposite: slow, patient, rhythmic movement that felt maddeningly passive. It also required terrain with the right kind of shadow patterns, which wasn't always available. The company officers heard about Harker's technique and were skeptical. During a briefing 2 weeks earlier, Harker had been asked to demonstrate and explain the shadow link method. He tried, but without the actual terrain and light conditions. It sounded strange. One of the officers, a captain named Brennan, dismissed it outright. "We're not training soldiers to be surveyors," Brennan said. "We need them to move fast, stay low, and use cover. This shadow business is too complicated and unreliable. I'm banning it from training. If men try to use it and fail, they'll get themselves killed." Harker had argued, but the decision was final. The shadow link was officially deemed an unnecessary and dangerous technique. Soldiers were ordered to stick to standard infantry movement doctrine: use terrain features for cover, move in short bursts, stay low, and rely on suppressive fire to cover advances. Harker was frustrated, but he accepted the order. He stopped teaching the method to his squad, but he didn't stop using it himself. Now, standing in the treeline watching the German observation post, Harker saw an opportunity. The morning sun was rising behind him, casting long shadows across the hillside. The shadows from the trees stretched up the slope toward the German bunker, creating dark corridors that intersected with patches of sunlight. The wind was steady, moving the branches overhead, creating a constant shifting pattern of light and dark. It was perfect terrain for the shadow link. Harker turned to his squad. There were 5 men with him: Corporal Mitch Dalton, Private Sam Oakes, Eddie Fletcher, Tony Rizzo, and a replacement named Billy Kern who had joined the unit 3 days ago. Harker explained what he had seen, the missing spotter, and his plan. He would use a shadow link to move up the slope and eliminate the German spotters one by one. Once the spotters were gone, the observation post would be blind, and Baker Company could advance without being detected. Dalton frowned. "Sarge," the captain banned that technique. "If you get caught using it and something goes wrong, you'll be court-martialed." Harker nodded. "I know, but if we don't take out those spotters, we're stuck here and more men die. I'm not asking you to use it. I'm going alone. You stay here and cover me if things go bad." Oak spoke up. "What if the spotters see you? You'll be out there with no backup." Harker smiled faintly. "They won't see me. That's the point." He checked his gear. He carried his M1 Garand rifle, a knife, 2 grenades, and a pair of wire cutters. He left his helmet behind because it reflected light, and moved to a cloth cap instead. He smeared mud on his face and hands to reduce any glint from his skin. Then he moved to the edge of the treeline and waited, watching the shadows, feeling the rhythm of the wind. When the moment was right, he stepped out of the trees and began to move. He didn't run. He didn't crouch low and dash like soldiers were trained to do. Instead, he walked slowly, deliberately, staying inside the shadow of a long oak tree that stretched up the hillside. His movements matched the sway of the branches overhead, stopping when the wind stopped, moving when the branches moved. To anyone watching from a distance, his silhouette blended into the shifting pattern of the shadow. He looked like a trick of the light, not a man. He covered 30 meters this way, moving from one shadow corridor to the next, pausing when he reached patches of sunlight, waiting for clouds to pass overhead and darken the ground before continuing. It was agonizingly slow. Every step required calculation, timing, focus. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced his breathing to stay calm and steady. He reached a cluster of bushes halfway up the slope and stopped, crouching low, scanning the bunker. He could see 2 spotters now. One was standing on the roof of the bunker with binoculars, sweeping the valley below. The other was near the entrance, writing something on a notepad. Harker studied their positions, their fields of view, their patterns of movement. The man on the roof scanned in a predictable rhythm. Left, center, right, then back to center. The man at the entrance looked up every few seconds, glancing around, then returned to his notepad. Neither of them was looking at the hillside directly in front of the bunker. That was a blind spot. Harker waited for the right moment, then moved again. This time he used the shadow of a stone wall that ran diagonally up the slope. The wall had been part of an old farm boundary, now crumbling and overgrown with weeds. He moved along its base, his body pressed against the stones, blending into the shadow. The spotter on the roof looked in his direction once, but Harker froze, his form merging with the irregular line of the wall. The spotter's gaze passed over him without pausing. Harker continued. He reached the edge of the bunker's perimeter, a point about 20 meters from the entrance. The spotter with the notepad was 10 meters away, still writing. Harker drew his knife and waited. The wind picked up, rustling the grass and weeds around the bunker. Harker moved with the wind, his steps masked by the sound of the rustling grass. He covered the distance in seconds, coming up behind the spotter silently. The man never heard him. Harker's hand clamped over the spotter's mouth. The knife moved once, and the man collapsed without a sound. Harker dragged the body into the shadow of the bunker wall and lowered it gently to the ground. One down. The spotter on the roof was still scanning the valley, unaware that his comrade was dead. Harker moved around the side of the bunker, staying low, using the building itself as cover. There was a ladder leading to the roof. Harker climbed it slowly, quietly, testing each rung before putting his weight on it. He reached the top and saw the spotter standing 3 meters away, his back turned, binoculars raised. Harker crossed the roof in 2 quick steps, grabbed the man from behind, and threw him off the roof. The spotter hit the ground hard, the impact breaking his neck. Harker froze, listening. No alarm, no shouts. The other spotters in the network hadn't noticed. 2 down. Harker descended the ladder and moved away from the bunker, heading toward the next observation post. This one was smaller, a foxhole dug into the hillside with sandbags piled around it. A single spotter sat inside, a radio handset pressed his ear, speaking quietly in German. Harker couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the calm, routine tone. The spotter was reporting the morning's observations, unaware that 2 of his colleagues were already dead. Harker circled around the foxhole, using a depression in the ground and the shadow of a large boulder to stay hidden. He reached a position behind the foxhole and paused, listening to the spotter's voice. The man finished his radio call and set the handset down, reaching for a canteen. Harker moved fast. He rose from the depression, crossed the distance, and struck the spotter with the butt of his rifle. The man slumped forward, unconscious. Harker checked his pulse. Still alive, but out cold. Harker cut the radio cable, smashed the handset, and moved on. 3 down. The 4th spotter was the most difficult. He was positioned on a rocky outcrop that jutted out from the hillside, giving him a wide, unobstructed view of the entire valley. There was no shadow that reached his position. The sun was higher now, and the long morning shadows had shortened. Harker studied the outcrop from a distance, looking for an angle, a weakness, anything he could exploit. He saw it. A narrow gully that ran along the base of the outcrop, hidden from above. If he could reach the gully, he could climb up behind the spotter. But reaching the gully meant crossing 50 meters of open ground in full daylight. The shadow link wouldn't work here. There were no shadows, no cover, no way to blend in. Harker needed a distraction. He pulled one of his grenades, removed the pin, and threw it far to the left away from his position. The grenade exploded with a loud crack, sending up a plume of dirt and smoke. The spotter on the outcrop spun toward the sound, raising his binoculars, shouting into his radio. Harker ran. He sprinted across the open ground, low and fast, reaching the gully just as the spotter turned back. Harker pressed himself against the rock wall, breathing hard, listening. The spotter was still talking into his radio, reporting the explosion, asking for instructions. Harker climbed the gully, using handholds in the rock, moving as quietly as he could. He reached the top and saw the spotter 5 meters away, standing at the edge of the outcrop, his back turned. Harker drew his knife and moved forward. His boot scraped against a loose stone, and the spotter heard it. The man turned, eyes wide, reaching for his rifle. Harker closed the distance in a heartbeat, tackling the spotter and driving the knife into his chest. The man gasped, struggled weakly, then went still. 4 down. Harker dragged the body away from the edge of the outcrop and took the spotter's binoculars. He scanned the area, looking for the 5th and final spotter. He found him quickly, A man positioned in a trench near a farmhouse, about 100 meters to the north. This spotter had a direct radio link to the German artillery batteries and was the most dangerous of the group. If he saw a Baker company advancing, he could call down a barrage in seconds. Harker checked the time. He had been moving for over an hour. His squad would be getting nervous. He needed to finish this quickly. He descended the outcrop and began moving toward the farmhouse, using every piece of cover he could find. A hedgerow, a burned-out tractor, a line of fence posts. The shadows were shorter now, and the shadow link was harder to execute, but Harker adapted. He moved in short bursts, timing his movement to match the rhythm of farm animals in the distance. The flicker of wind through tall grass, the subtle shifts in light as clouds drifted overhead. He reached the farmhouse and circled around to the back. The trench was on the north side, dug along a low stone wall. Harker could see the spotter's helmet above the edge of the trench, bobbing slightly as the man moved. Harker approached from behind, moving along the base of the wall, staying low. He reached the trench and looked down. The spotter was sitting with his back to Harker, the radio on his lap, headphones over his ears. He was listening to something, nodding along, completely unaware. Harker dropped into the trench behind him. The spotter heard the sound and started to turn, but Harker was already moving. He grabbed the man's head and twisted hard. The spotter's neck snapped with a sickening crack, and he went limp. Harker pulled the body to the side and grabbed the radio. He smashed it against the trench wall, then cut the antenna cable for good measure. 5 down. Harker climbed out of the trench and stood there for a moment, breathing hard, his body shaking from the adrenaline. He had done it. The entire German observation network was gone. The spotters who had been watching every approach, calling down artillery on every movement, were dead or incapacitated. The hill was blind. He pulled a signal flare from his pack and fired it into the air. It arced up, trailing red smoke, the prearranged signal that the area was clear. Back at the treeline, Dalton and the others saw the flare and radioed Baker Company. Within minutes, the company was moving forward, advancing up the hillside in squad-sized groups, expecting to be hit by artillery at any moment. But no artillery came, no machine gun fire, no resistance at all. They reached the bunker and the observation posts and found the bodies. They found the smashed radios. They realized what happened. Captain Brennan arrived 30 minutes later, furious and confused. "Who the hell authorized this?" he demanded. Dalton pointed at Harker, who was sitting on the ground near the bunker, drinking from a canteen, his hands still shaking. Brennan stormed over. "Sergeant, you used a bad technique. You disobeyed a direct order. You could have gotten yourself killed and compromised this entire operation." Harker looked up at him, too tired to care about the consequences. "The technique worked, sir. The spotters are gone. We can advance." Brennan stared at him for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then he looked at the dead spotters, the smashed radios, the clear hillside. He looked back at Harker. "You're damn lucky it worked," he said finally. "But if you ever pull something like this again without authorization, I'll have you court-martialed." "Understood." "Yes, sir." Brennan turned and walked away, barking orders at his platoon leaders. But as he left, Harker saw something in the captain's expression. Not anger, not disapproval. Respect. Grudging, reluctant respect. Over the next 2 days, Baker Company advanced rapidly through the sector, taking objectives with minimal casualties. Without the German observation network, the enemy artillery was blind, firing blindly at empty fields and missing their targets. The German defenses collapsed faster than anyone had expected. Harker's elimination of the 5 spotters had been the key. It had broken the stalemate and opened the door for the advance. Word of what Harker had done spread through the regiment. Officers who had dismissed the shadow link technique started asking questions. How had he moved undetected across open ground? How had he eliminated 5 spotters without being seen? Harker tried to explain, but it was difficult. The technique wasn't something that could be easily taught in a classroom or demonstrated on a training field. It required experience, intuition, and the right terrain. Most soldiers didn't have the patience for it, but a few did. A handful of scouts and snipers and other units heard about the Shadow Link and sought Harker out, asking him to teach them. Harker agreed, working with them during downtime, showing them the principles, the timing, the way to read shadows and movement. Some of them got it, some didn't, but those who did became extraordinarily effective scouts, able to move through enemy territory with a ghost-like invisibility that baffled German observers. The ban on the technique was quietly lifted. Captain Brennan never officially acknowledged it, but he stopped punishing soldiers who used it, and he started including shadow-based movement in the company's tactical planning. By the end of the war, the Shadow Link had become an unofficial part of the unit's doctrine, passed down from veteran to replacement, a skill that existed outside the official manuals but was valued by those who understood it. Harker survived the war. He was in Germany when the surrender came in May 1945, and he returned home to Oregon a few months later. He went back to surveying, back to the quiet work of mapping forests and plotting roads. He didn't talk much about the war. When people asked, he gave short answers and changed the subject. The memories were too complicated, too heavy. He had killed 5 men in a single morning, and while he believed it had been necessary, it wasn't something he was proud of. It was just something he had done, but the Shadow Link stayed with him. When he walked through forests, he found himself moving instinctively along shadow lines, timing his steps to the sway of branches, blending into the shifting patterns of light. It was a habit he couldn't break, a skill that had become part of his body. And sometimes on quiet mornings when the light was just right, he would stop and watch the shadows move, remembering the hillside, the spotters, the feeling of moving unseen through enemy territory. Harker died in 1982 at the age of 63. He left behind a wife, 2 children, and a small house in the Oregon woods. He was buried with military honors, but the ceremony was brief and simple. There was no mention of the Shadow Link, no recognition of the technique he had developed or the lives it had saved. The Army had no official record of it. It existed only in the memories of the men who had learned it, used it, and passed it on. But the story didn't die with Harker. It lived on in the oral tradition of the infantry, told and retold in barracks and training camps, embellished and simplified, but always carrying the same core truth. Movement is survival, and the best way to move is the way the enemy can't see. The Shadow Link became a legend, a technique that officially never existed but was quietly practiced by scouts and snipers for decades after the war. What made Harker's story remarkable wasn't just the tactical success of the Shadow Link. It was his willingness to trust his own judgment over official doctrine. The Army had banned the technique, deemed it too risky and unreliable. But Harker knew it worked because he had tested it, refined it, proven it in the field. When the moment came, when his unit was stuck and men were dying, he didn't wait for permission. He didn't argue with his superiors or try to convince them. He simply did what needed to be done, using the tools and skills he had, regardless of whether they were officially approved. That kind of initiative is rare in military organizations, where following orders and adhering to doctrine are fundamental values. Soldiers are trained to obey, to trust the system, to believe that the manual has all the answers. But the reality of combat is messier than any manual can account for. Every battlefield is different. Every situation is unique. The soldiers who survive are the ones who can adapt, who can recognize when a manual doesn't apply and improvise something better. Harker was one of those soldiers. He saw a problem, developed a solution, and executed it with precision and discipline. He didn't do it for glory or recognition. He did it because it was the right thing to do, because it gave his unit a chance to advance without losing more men, because he had the skills to make it happen and no one else did. But his willingness to act independently came with a cost. He violated orders. He used a ban technique. He put his career and his freedom at risk. If the mission had failed, it had been spotted and killed, Captain Brennan would have been justified in blaming Harker for disobeying orders and jeopardizing the operation. Harker knew that risk and accepted it. He understood that leadership sometimes means making decisions that could get you punished, that doing the right thing and following the rules aren't always the same. That's a hard lesson, and one that many people never learn. We're taught from childhood to follow the rules, to respect authority, to trust the system. And most of the time, that's the right thing to do. Systems exist for good reasons. Rules are designed to protect us, to maintain order, to prevent chaos. But systems aren't perfect. Rules can be wrong. And when following them leads to disaster, someone has to have the courage to break them. Harker had that courage. He broke the rule because the rule was killing his comrades. He used the band technique because the approved techniques weren't working. He trusted his own judgment over the judgment of his superiors because he had more experience with the specific problem they were facing. And he was right. But being right doesn't always protect you from punishment. Harker was lucky that the mission succeeded. If it hadn't, his career would have been over. He would have been court-martialed, possibly imprisoned, certainly dishonored. The difference between a hero and a criminal is often just the outcome of the decision, not the decision itself. Harker understood that, and he made the choice anyway. That's what separates extraordinary people from ordinary ones. Not intelligence or skill or bravery, though those matter, but the willingness to take responsibility for difficult decisions, to accept the consequences of being wrong, to trust yourself when everyone else doubts you. Harker had that quality. He didn't need approval or validation. He didn't need to be told he was right. He just needed to know in his own mind that he was doing the best he could with the information and skills he had. The shadow link itself was a reflection of Harker's mindset. It wasn't a technique designed for aggressive action or rapid assault. It was a technique designed for patience, observation, and subtlety. It required the user to slow down, to think, to move in harmony with the environment rather than against it. Most soldiers couldn't do that. They were trained to be aggressive, to dominate the battlefield, to impose their will on the enemy through firepower and speed. The shadow link was the opposite. It was about becoming invisible, about moving through the enemy's perception without triggering it, about winning without being seen. That approach required a different kind of courage. Not the courage to charge into gunfire, but the courage to move slowly through a kill zone, trusting that your technique would keep you hidden. Not the courage to fight, but the courage to wait, to hold still when every instinct screamed at you to run. It was a quiet, patient courage that didn't look heroic from the outside, but was just as difficult, just as dangerous as any frontal assault. Harker's story also reveals something about innovation in military organizations. The shadow link was a new idea developed by a soldier in the field, based on his civilian experience and personal observations. It wasn't invented by generals or strategists or training schools. It came from the bottom up, from someone who saw a problem and figured out a solution. But when Harker tried to share it, the system rejected it. Officers deemed it too complicated, too unreliable, too different from existing doctrine. They banned it not because it didn't work, but because it didn't fit their understanding of how soldiers should move. That kind of institutional resistance to innovation is common in large organizations, especially military ones. The system values predictability, standardization, and control. New ideas that challenge established doctrine are threatening because they undermine the authority of the people who designed that doctrine. If a sergeant can develop a better technique than the one taught at officer school, what does that say about the quality of the training? What does it say about the expertise of the leadership? So new ideas get suppressed, not because they're bad, but because they're inconvenient, and the people who develop them are often punished, sidelined, or ignored. Harker was lucky that his idea was proven effective in a way that couldn't be denied. 5 dead spotters and a successful advance made it impossible for his superiors to dismiss the shadow link as worthless. But how many other ideas, other techniques, other innovations were suppressed and never given a chance because the right circumstances didn't occur? The tragedy is that those lost innovations might have saved lives. They might have shortened the war. They might have changed history. But we'll never know because the system didn't allow them to be tested. The system valued conformity over creativity, obedience over initiative, doctrine over results. Harker's willingness to violate that system, to use the shadow link despite the ban, was an act of rebellion, a small rebellion, a personal rebellion, but a rebellion nonetheless. He chose effectiveness over obedience. He chose lives over rules. And in doing so, he demonstrated that sometimes the most important thing a soldier can do is think for himself. That's the real lesson of Harker's story. Not that the shadow link was a great technique, though it was. Not that innovation matters, though it does. but that individuals have the power to change outcomes, even when the system says they don't. Harker was one man, a sergeant, a surveyor turned soldier with no special authority or influence. But he saw a problem, developed a solution, and executed it with skill and determination. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't ask for approval. He just did what needed to be done. And because he did, 5 German spotters died, a hillside was cleared, a company advanced, and lives were saved. The system didn't reward him for it. The system barely acknowledged it. But the men who survived because of his actions remembered. They told the story. They passed it on. They made sure that even if the army forgot, the truth would survive. That's how real change happens. Not through official channels or formal recognition, but through the quiet, stubborn actions of individuals who refuse to accept that the way things are is the way they have to be. Harker refused to accept that his unit had to stay pinned down, losing men, because the approved techniques weren't working. He found another way, and in finding it, he proved that one person, with the right skills and the right mindset, can make a difference. The shadow link technique eventually faded from use. As warfare evolved, as technology changed, as new generations of soldiers brought new ideas, the old methods were forgotten. Today, few people have ever heard of it. It exists in dusty after-action reports, in faded training notes, in the memories of aging veterans who learned it decades ago. But the principle behind it, the idea that you can move unseen if you understand light, and shadow and timing, that principle remains true. It's used by hunters, by wildlife photographers, by anyone who needs to approach something without being detected. And in a way, that's Harker's real legacy. Not the technique itself, but the idea that there are always other ways to solve a problem, if you're willing to look for them. That innovation doesn't require genius or resources or authority. It just requires observation, creativity, and the willingness to try something different. Harker was a surveyor who became a soldier and brought his surveyor's eye to the battlefield. He saw the world differently than his comrades, and that different perspective gave him an advantage. We all have different perspectives, different experiences, different ways of seeing the world. Those differences are valuable. They give us tools that others don't have, insights that others miss, solutions that others can't imagine. But only if we trust them, only if we're willing to act on them, even when the system says we shouldn't, even when the rules say we can't, even when everyone else thinks we're wrong. Harker trusted his perspective. He trusted his experience. He trusted himself. And because he did, he survived the war. His unit advanced, and a technique that shouldn't have worked became a legend. That's the power of trusting yourself. Not arrogance, not recklessness, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your skills, understanding your strengths, and believing that you have something valuable to contribute, even if no one else sees it yet. David Harker was an ordinary man who did something extraordinary. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't charge machine gun nests or save wounded comrades under fire. He just moved quietly through the shadows, eliminated 5 enemy spotters, and changed the course of a battle. But in doing so, he demonstrated something profound, that the greatest acts of courage often happen in silence, unseen, unrecognized, known only to the person who performed them and the few who witnessed them. Those acts matter just as much as the dramatic, visible ones. Maybe more, because they're harder. They require you to act without the reward of recognition, without the validation of praise, without the assurance that anyone will ever know what you did. You have to do them because they're right, because they're necessary, because you're the only one who can. That's the truest form of courage. And that's what Harker had. The line on the hillside held that day. Not because of firepower or numbers or superior tactics, but because one man refused to accept defeat, developed a solution the system had rejected, and executed it with precision and discipline. One man who moved through the shadows, unseen and unheard, and changed everything. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him. And wherever you're watching from, comment below. Let's make sure these stories never fade into the shadows they were born from.